First of all, to those who are not paying attention to what is going down in Afghanistan, as well as to those who are, this is a big deal, a really big deal. It will have profound implications, obviously, for the people of Afghanistan and for the world as a whole. For a defeat of the world's most powerful imperialist country has big repercussions. And that this defeat has brought back the Taliban with its theocratic, highly repressive reactionary form of rule will reverberate throughout the Mideast, South Asia, and North Africa, inspiring and fueling Islamic fundamentalist movements while intensifying inter-imperialist rivalries. There are 4 points that we will just touch on today and what will be our ongoing coverage over the coming weeks in this developing situation. They are: 1, briefly, the humiliating defeat for the U.S. can have important ramifications for the prospect for revolution. 2, the U.S. was not a liberator and is not the good guys. 3, the Taliban is a reactionary force that will bring a nightmare for the people, and especially the women of Afghanistan. And 4, there is a whole far better way the world could be through a revolution guided by and for the objectives of the new communism. And that way requires you to get with and get into the Revcoms and the leadership of Bob Avakian. The humiliating defeat of the U.S. in Afghanistan is shaped by and is shaping the sharp divide between the fascists and the liberals as they fight viciously over who is to blame. And this is not the blame game of past partisan politics as usual. Rather, it is the heightening of the conflict between 2 sections of the ruling class and 2 sections of the people over the future. The Republican fascists are determined to radically change the form of rule of the U.S. to an open, terroristic form of fascist dictatorship, while the Democrats are seeking to maintain the U.S. empire under what has been the form of rule of this country since its founding, bourgeois democracy, with some democratic and civil rights, while its essence is vicious dictatorship over those it exploits and oppresses here and around the world. The U.S. defeat in Afghanistan cannot but intensify this divide. What is critical to understand as the momentous document issued by the Revcoms, a declaration, a call to get organized now for a real revolution, puts forth. These divisions cannot be overcome within the way this country has been held together, and this opens up the rare potential for a real revolution. In short, the U.S. defeat in Afghanistan could become part of the mix which strengthens the pole and the organized movement for an actual revolution, bringing closer the time when a revolution could really be made. This is one key reason why we welcome the defeat of the U.S. in Afghanistan. But a revolution can only happen if people take up the scientific understanding of why we need a revolution, what it actually involves, and what it is for. And a key part of this taking shape is understanding that America is not the good guys in the world. As you watch the vaunted United States military attempt to evacuate its personnel, as well as those Afghanis who over the last 20 years it has fooled or bribed that it would bring real change and who now stand betrayed, you must not be bamboozled by the blathering of the media, including much of the alternative media, that there was a better way this evacuation could have been done. To get at this, Bob Avakian, in his book, The New Communism, quotes the great revolutionary V.I. Lenin, who led the Russian Revolution in 1917, and wrote, quote, "People always were and always will be the foolish victims of deceit and self-deceit in politics until they learn to discover the interests of some class or other behind all moral, religious, political, and social phrases, declarations, and promises. The supporters of reforms and improvements will always be fooled by the defenders of the old order until they realize that every old institution, however barbarous and rotten it may appear to be, is maintained by the forces of some ruling classes." End quote. We have to look at events like the defeat in Afghanistan and really every political and social phenomena with a scientific method and approach. What is the deeper reality? Why was the U.S. in Afghanistan? Whose and what interests are served by the U.S. occupying this country? Could it really be true that the U.S., in which misogyny and patriarchy are rampant with sexual abuse, rape, and the discrimination pouring forth endlessly and the right to abortion hanging by a thread, could it really be that the U.S. was in Afghanistan to liberate women? You are being systematically lied to, and your thinking shaped by the ruling institutions such as the media and political process, as well as the functioning of the system, to think this way. And until we see through the lies they tell us, and until we struggle sometimes sharply with those who believe those lies, not only will we be complicit in the crimes of this system, we will not be able to build the forces and seize the time when revolution could be launched and won. So what do the U.S. media and politicians say? And what is the reality? The U.S. said it invaded Afghanistan 20 years ago to stamp out terrorism and bring democracy and liberate women. But what about the terrorism they went to stamp out? When al-Qaeda flew hijacked airplanes into the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, 9/11, they took the lives of nearly 3,000 people. The U.S. then launched its so-called war on terror that would soon stretch into Iraq and points east and south, and they caused the deaths of over 1 million people, most of them civilians, and at least 110,000 and perhaps as many as 210,000 people in Afghanistan alone. The violence unleashed by the U.S. has been staggering. Between 2014 and 2018, it dropped over 38,000 bombs in Afghanistan. As of March 2020, it had carried out over 12,000 drone strikes. More than half the country is food insecure, with half the children under 5 seriously malnourished. And in fact, the so-called fighter against terrorism, the United States, has killed nearly 10 million people since the end of World War II. In its wars, coups, and proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Guatemala, Iran, Iraq, Chile, El Salvador, the list goes on and on and on. What about the democracy the U.S. brought? A democracy of puppets serving U.S. interests, a coalition of warlords and opportunists backed by a U.S.-financed Afghanistani army which began to collapse as soon as the U.S. Army pulled out. This was a society and an army forged by the U.S. through alliances with an ugly array of feudal tribal leaders, warlords, as I said. These regional despots were won over to the U.S. by a combination of bribes, perceived opportunities to increase their power over the people of Afghanistan, and/or rivalries and feuds with the equally reactionary Taliban forces. What about the liberation of women? It is true that a minority of some Afghan women and girls, especially in the capital Kabul and a few other urban places, got a chance to get some basic rights. These rights will now almost certainly be snatched away under the barbaric rule of fanatical Islamic fundamentalism. Revcom reported last year that some 2/3 of Afghan girls still don't attend school, and some 87% are illiterate. At least 70 to 80% are forced into marriage, many before the age of 16. Afghanistan has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world, and nearly 90% of Afghan women are victims of domestic abuse. Amnesty International calls it one of the worst places in the world to be a woman. The U.S. directed liberation of women did not and could not strike at the roots of the patriarchal relations in Afghanistan, nor were they intended to. The fundamental change in the situation of women can only come about from a thoroughgoing communist revolution in which gender oppression is targeted from the beginning, and in which the economic, social, political, and ideological roots are dug up. In reality, the real reason the U.S. invaded and then occupied Afghanistan was, as Revcom.us wrote this week, quote, while this mission was draped in all kinds of honeyed phrases about spreading democracy and liberating women, in its essence, it was about two things. First, delivering the mafioso-style message to every other force in the world that if they dared attack the U.S. or even allowed an attack to take place from their soil, They would be destroyed with a vengeance 100 times worse. Second, trying to radically and violently extend the U.S. power in a much broader and deeper way into the Middle East and Central Asia, and beyond that, the world. Power that exists to defend a worldwide empire of exploitation, terrible oppression, and destructive plunder of the environment. Donald Rumsfeld, then Secretary of Defense, explicitly said after the September 11th attack on the World Trade Center, "Go massive, sweep it all up, things related and things not." End quote. The U.S. was not and is not and never can be the good guys. And if you think I'm wrong, listen to this from Bob Avakian.
One of the biggest obstacles standing in the way and weighing people down is American chauvinism. The disgusting notion that America and Americans are better and more important than everybody else. This is a poison infecting people broadly in this country, even among the bitterly oppressed. And there is a great need for people to break with this American chauvinism. Free yourself from the GTF, the great tautological fallacy. A fallacy, an idea or way of thinking that is false, wrong. A tautology, a round in a circle way of reasoning that asserts something and then claims to prove it by merely asserting the same thing again. So the great tautological fallacy to which I am referring is the notion that America is a force for good in the world, and therefore whatever it does is good, or at least done with good intentions, even if the same thing, when done by other forces, especially by forces opposed to us, is bad, is evil, because America is a force for good in the world. Thus, in the grip of the great tautological fallacy, when one is told by the authorities and government and the media, etc., that North Korea developing a small number of nuclear weapons and a few long-range ballistic missiles poses a grave threat, one does not question. One does not ask why that is a grave threat, while the only country ever to use nuclear weapons, the United States, having thousands of nuclear weapons and the capability to use them anywhere in the world, is somehow not a grave threat. Under the influence of the great tautological fallacy, one does not stop to think about the fact that in this situation, North Korea could only be developing this weaponry as an attempt to deter an attack from the United States. For North Korea's leaders know that if they initiated an attack, they would face massive, overwhelming retaliation. And from the point of view of the imperial rulers of the United States, such a possibility of deterrence is precisely the problem, because it could in some measure limit the ability of the U.S. to dominate and dictate. Once you remove the blinders of the great tautological fallacy, it can be seen that the free world simply means those parts of the world that are under the domination of or are friendly to the United States, no matter how monstrous their ruling classes may be, while the non-free world is made up of those who remain outside of, and especially those who oppose opposition or obstacles to the domination of the U.S. empire. The U.S. government wages war in Africa and Asia, as well as the Middle East, claiming it is fighting to defend civilization against the brutal and murderous Islamic fundamentalist jihadists. But the imperialists of the U.S. are certainly no less brutal and murderous. And the civilization they boast of is literally built on the blood and bones of people all over the world. And why is this Islamic fundamentalism such a force now? Fundamentally, because of the workings of capitalist imperialism itself. Besides the overall role of imperialism in creating more favorable soil for these Islamic fundamentalists, actions of the U.S. imperialists have further fed their growth. In the 1980s, the U.S. actually armed and built up Osama bin Laden and other Islamic fundamentalists to strike at the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. In 2003, in violation of international law, The U.S. invaded Iraq to overthrow the head of government there, Saddam Hussein. This invasion was carried out under the cover of lies that Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. This invasion and the occupation of Iraq by American forces that followed caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, set off bloody conflicts among the Iraqi people, and created more fertile ground for Islamic fundamentalist forces. And the same thing happened in Libya. Under the presidency of Barack Obama, and with the insistent urging of then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, the U.S. intervened in a conflict within Libya on the side of forces opposed to the longtime ruler Muammar Gaddafi. With the fall of Gaddafi, which was brought about mainly as a result of massive bombing of his forces by the U.S. and its allies, the rivalries and conflicts within Libya were intensified and Islamic fundamentalist forces gained strength. Or take the case of Iran. In 1953, the CIA engineered a coup that overthrew a popular government that was moving to nationalize the oil of the country so that it could be used for the development of its economy instead of being controlled and plundered by the US and Britain. This coup brought the Shah of Iran to power, and the people of Iran suffered decades of torment and torture at the hands of the Shah and his secret police. And here again, these actions of the US created more favorable ground for the forces of Islamic fundamentalism, which ultimately seized power through the revolution that overthrew the Shah in 1979. These are only a few examples of the American crimes that have been committed and the kinds of consequences that have followed from these crimes in countries all over the world. And all this underlines the crucial importance of casting off the blinders of the great tautological fallacy and breaking with American chauvinism. We need to think about humanity first and above all.
That was Bob Avakian in 2017 in a speech during Trump's first year in office. The Trump-Pence regime must go. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. A better world is possible. The defeat of the number one oppressor in the world today is a very good thing. What has been defeated is not democracy. It is a defeat of a vicious and ambitious attempt by the capitalist, imperialist ruling class of the United States to extend its domination of the world further and deeper. That is why we welcome this defeat, and why you and all oppressed people, all who yearn to be free of this capitalist, imperialist U.S. empire, should welcome this defeat too. But wait, you say, look who's coming in behind them, the Taliban. And the fact is that the rule of the Taliban will be a horror. Do not be lulled by the promises of the Taliban of moderation and blathering in the U.S. liberal media about, quote, with the internet they can't turn back the clock to the 9th or the 14th century. They can. Islamic fundamentalist theocratic rule is a fucking nightmare, and especially for women. Already in an interview with a woman reporter, a representative of the Taliban said that women would have to have their faces completely covered behind the burqa. Under Taliban rule from 1996 to 2001, women were forced to wear burqas. They were prevented from going to school after the age of 8. They were barred from most work and couldn't even go out of their homes without male supervision. Sexual apartheid was practiced throughout society, and women guilty of even minor infractions were subjected to public floggings, even killed. The Taliban's atrocities, like the stonings of women in stadiums for crimes such as adultery, sickened people across the globe. The Taliban targeted people of other religions, even other branches of Islam. And no, my enemy's enemy is not my friend or ally. And know again that a reactionary movement that defeats U.S. imperialism does not make it a positive anti-imperialist force. In actual fact, the Taliban, like the Islamic Republic of Iran, will seek to work with and profit from imperialism, and will impose a 9th century oppressive social order on a 21st century capitalist economic base. Islamic fundamentalism is a false path appealing to some who are angry and searching, but it is an important part of keeping the world as it actually is. The Taliban are not fighting in any way, shape, or form for the liberation of Afghanistan from imperialist oppression. They represent the interests and aspirations of those backward feudal landlords and patriarchs who desperately want a place in that imperialist system for their outmoded way of life. Bob Avakian characterized this dynamic in this way, quote, "What we see in contention here with jihad on the one hand and McWorld McCrusade, which means increasingly globalized Western imperialism, on the other hand, are historically outmoded strata among colonized and oppressed humanity up against historically outmoded ruling strata of the imperialist system. These two reactionary poles reinforce each other, even while opposing each other. If you side with either one of these outmodeds, you end up strengthening both." While this is a very important formulation and is crucial to understanding much of the dynamics driving things in the world in this period, at the same time we do have to be clear about which of these historically outmodeds has done the greater damage and poses the greater threat to humanity. It is the historically outmoded ruling strata of the imperialist system, and in particular, the U.S. imperialists. This is from Basics, quote number 128. Think about it, two outmoded ruling classes that reinforce each other even while opposing each other. They lock people in what seems like a horrible either-or. But this is not all there is. There is a liberating alternative, the new communism brought forward by Bob Avakian, which sets forth a road to emancipate all of humanity. There is no need to choose between the open enslavement of and brutality toward women by Islamic fundamentalist jihadism and the imperialist empire that promises an empty liberation for a few. There is no need to keep making your peace with a world in which 6 billion suffer, enslave, and face the constant threat of repression or death, often forced to flee on the open seas or across the desert for safety or food, so that a relative handful of those who live in the imperialist countries can live lives of privileges. While the masses of people, even in the U.S., struggle to get by and endure the weight of life-stealing and spirit-crushing exploitation and oppression. A world where, as in Afghanistan and Iraq, and too many other places to name, this system is defended by murderous military force, and where this capitalist imperialist monstrosity of a system destroys the environment, possibly making the earth unlivable, perhaps in this century. There is another way. We have to do all we can to make this real by making revolution here and spreading the new communism, not just in this country, but all over the world. And you have to get into this, learn about it, and support the revolution. Be part of spreading the word, and join the revolution. This is true hope, hope on a scientific basis. But it will just remain hope and possibility, and not reality. And the horror will dominate and suffocate and mutilate bodies and spirits, ever more directly threatening our very existence, unless you become involved. Get into the work of Bob Avakian. The Constitution for a New Socialist Republic in North America, which he authored, presents a vision and a plan for a new society that will, on day one, unleash the creativity of the masses of people to go to work on overcoming all forms of oppression and exploitation, and on protecting the environment, all towards the aim of the emancipation of humanity throughout the world. In the second half of our show today, we will get into how this new socialist republic would deal with a pandemic like we face today with COVID. As we look with outrage at the horror of what the U.S. did to Afghanistan, as we rightly recoil at the regime of the Taliban, and as we recognize that this defeat for the world's greatest oppressor, U.S. imperialism, holds the potential to further open up the possibility for revolution, for a radically different and far better world, recognize this. For any positive resolution to be born of this requires that you get into the scientifically grounded new communism, and on that basis, become part of the movement for a real revolution to bring about a future fit for humanity. We want to conclude with these words from Bob Avakian's New Communism.
The new synthesis of communism brought forward by Bob Avakian represents a qualitative advance in the scientific approach to making revolution and emancipating humanity. There is an urgent need for this new synthesis to be taken up broadly in this society and in the world as a whole. Everywhere people are questioning why things are the way they are and whether a different world is possible. Everywhere people are talking about revolution but have no real understanding of what revolution means, no scientific approach to analyzing and dealing with what they are up against and what needs to be done. Everywhere people are rising up in rebellion, but are hemmed in, let down, and left to the mercy of murderous oppressors, or misled onto paths which only reinforce, often with barbaric brutality, the enslaving chains of tradition. Everywhere people need a way out of their desperate conditions, but do not see the source of their suffering and the path forward out of the darkness.